Right, good evening everyone. Welcome to our Interfaith Lecture 2023. We're very delighted to have Elisabeth Becker from the University of Heidelberg. But before she starts on her lecture, I just wanted to a couple of words about Interfaith Week. We have been hosting Interfaith Week for many, many years at Southampton through the Parks Institute, based on James Parks and his commitment to Jewish, non-Jewish relations, which we've widened out not just to include Jewish, non-Jewish, but to consider other faiths and communities, and working with faith organizations in the local area and the Faith and Reflection Center at the university to make sure that students at the university and staff and local residents have this space and environment for interfaith dialogue, which we are aware of more than ever now is something really, really important for development of peace and tolerance between lots of different groups. We had a panel on faith and mental health, and now we're very lucky to have an excellent lecture coming up. So I'll hand it over to Sammy. Thank you.
Okay, so my name is Sammy Everett. I'm a senior research fellow here at the University of Southampton, and I work between the wonderful Parks Institute and the Winchester School of Art. I also work on Jewish-Muslim relations through philosophy, performance, and other forms of organic dialogue. I guess it makes sense for me to chair you. Elisabeth Becker is a Freigeist, which means free spirit, fellow at the Max Weber Institute for Sociology at the University of Heidelberg, which is Germany's oldest, dating to the 14th century university and one of its most prestigious universities, good evening. So Elisabeth is a cultural sociologist. I didn't know what this meant until I met Elisabeth. She trained at Cornell. She studied at Oxford also, and worked on her PhD at Yale, where she wrote on various mosque communities in Europe. And her thesis now exists as a monograph, which is called Mosques in the Metropolis. Incivility. The sound isn't very clear, slightly distorted. I don't know if anyone, you want it? Yeah. Okay. Mosques in the Metropolis, I'm sorry, Elizabeth. That's out with Chicago University Press 2021. And she's now working on a new book, extracts from which she's going to speak to us about this evening, which is entitled The Moving Lives of Jewish Berlin, Uniting 21st Century Jewish Berliners with 19th and early 20th century Jewish Berliners through texts, walking interviews, and the topography of the city of Berlin. We're delighted to have you here this evening, and I will chair and field questions after this. So take it away, Holly.
Thank you.
Should I just check it the right
Yeah,
way?
go
I think it's because the computer was over here.
Okay.
So let's check.
Yeah. Oh, it was the wrong one.
Can you hear better now, everyone at home?
Let's hope. Great. So thank you so much for inviting me for this talk. Obviously, it feels very timely. When I came up with the idea for this talk, I was not going to talk about the conflict in Israel and Palestine, but I will actually in some ways bring that in because it seems strange not to. And we had this conversation and how it relates to my research and this topic. It's also great because Sami and I have been having these conversations for years now. I don't know how many years, about Jewish and Muslim relations, as well as the relations of both Jews and Muslims together and apart to European societies. So different societies across Europe, France, Germany, in my case, mostly also the UK and others. And I also am a co-editor of Patterns of Prejudice with Tony. And so it's just really nice to be here and kind of experience Parks for the first time in real life. I think I started that during the pandemic, so it's been strange. So I will start the presentation. I'll just make sure should I share the screen first? Great. Now the title of this presentation is another fateful triangle: Jews, Muslims, and Europe. You might know, if you know Stuart Hall's work, that I've basically taken the title of one of his books, which is A Fateful Triangle, where he's talking about race, ethnicity, and the nation. But I want to talk about this other fateful triangle of Muslims, Jews, and Europe, and the ways in which this kind of triangulated relationship, rather than the sort of dualistic or duo type relationships that we often have in these conversations, right? When we think about dialogue or exchange, it's usually one-on-one or two groups speaking with one another. But what I argue, what I believe, is that in the case of Europe, Jews and Muslims in Europe, the conversation you're always having is one between Jews and Muslims and European societies in one form or another. So it's hard to kind of isolate that dialogue or that dialectical conversation between two. Now, what I will talk about today mostly, as my kind of exemplar case, does come from my second book project on Jewish Berlin, which is also really, I don't want to say a wolf in sheep's clothing, but it is a story about Jewish Berlin, but it is also a story about multicultural Berlin, plural Berlin. What does Berlin look like today in relationship to its Jewish past? Part of that is a Jewish-Muslim story as well. I'm going to focus on one institution, that's the Jewish Museum Berlin. Some of you might have visited or know about this museum. It is a kind of emblematic example of representing Jewish life, both historically and in the contemporary period. And I will focus on that and this, how this kind of changing institution and its genealogy, mostly over the last decade, also maps onto the genealogy of conflict in the Middle East, specifically in Israel and Palestine. How happenings in Israel and Palestine have influenced this institution and shaped its directions, and also created a sort of impetus for its dissolving and rebuilding. So I will turn to that in a moment. I think that is the image of Stuart Hall's book, The Fateful Triangle. So before I begin this kind of narrative story from my research, I want to say that although I'll talk about Jews and Muslims, I think probably anyone in this room or who's interested in these topics knows this, but I feel I have to say it. These are really plural groups that I'm talking about. So I will talk about Jews and Muslims, but again, these are really plural groups. In the Berlin context, Jews are mostly those who migrated from the former Soviet Union, as well as a growing population of Israelis and American Jews, and a small population of German Jews who were born in exile and returned right after the war as children. Those who ran the Jewish Museum, and Silly Kugelmann, who was the head curator for over 20 years, are German Jews who returned from exile as children and then grew up in Germany. She grew up in Frankfurt, but throughout Germany. Now, also before I start that story, I want to kind of frame it with what's happening right now, not in terms of what's happening in Israel and Palestine in relationship just to the region, but how that's influencing this triangle as we speak. I could have chosen any number of headlines, like I could have chosen thousands of headlines, but these are just examples. So we see in France how Macron calls for unity in France after the Hamas attacks, and he actually in this article discusses, this was in The Guardian as well, he discusses how Jewish and Muslim populations have to come together and speak with one another. This was in the early days after the Hamas attack. So I think this was published around October 10th. In the next image, we see a piece from Bloomberg Press, how Jews are hiding their faith while Islamophobic graffiti targets Muslims in London. And there's the fallout from the Israel-Hamas conflict that's affecting UK Jews and Muslims together. And there's this kind of support for Israel, again, in the early days after the attacks. Now there's this piece, which argues that Jews are frightened by Sadiq Khan, the mayor of London. And this suggests a more divisive approach to interpreting how the conflict is affecting life in Europe. And there is this trope, which you will hear me talk about extensively, probably too much in this talk, which is that Muslims basically are the bearers of a quote unquote new anti-Semitism. They've brought it, they've imported it actually specifically from Palestine, but from the broader Middle East. And now this kind of new anti-Semitism is rearing its ugly head. And you see among Muslim quote unquote migrants, although many people spoken about in this article are born and raised in Germany, that they are unsettling Germany because it's haunted by the Holocaust. And for this reason, pro-Palestinian demonstrations are being barred. Since in the last few days, actually, many things have been banned in Germany. So the statement from the river to the sea cannot be spoken publicly in Berlin anymore without a fine or threat of imprisonment. So Germany has a very specific part in the story. I think Europe, of course, as a whole does, but Germany, of course, plays a very specific role in how it frames the conflict. Now, in this, this is a kind of similar framing in the actual, you're not reading the whole article, but this kind of again says that Jews are going to become the target of Muslim anger and hatred across Europe. But you have counter examples, and Sami and I spoke about this when I was preparing this lecture. You have Jews for Peace and various kind of Jewish organizations, for instance, this last weekend in London, who were calling for a ceasefire and were marching publicly. So there are kind of counters to this narrative of Jews being in danger of Muslims in Europe or in the world. And this is an image from one of, well, he's been someone that I've worked with over the years, but he runs, his name is Dervis Hizarchi. He runs an organization called the Kreuzberg Initiative Against Anti-Semitism in Berlin. And his work brings Jewish and Muslim students together. It also tries to override stereotypes about Jews and Muslims. But he had many images from, this is a synagogue in Berlin, the Frankfurter Synagogue. He was there, many he's Muslim, many Muslim civil society representatives went to synagogues after the attacks. Many Muslim politicians went to synagogues after the attacks. So you have this kind of, with both groups, aligning themselves with one another as well and providing counter narratives, often on social media. So I'm sure you all know that media is not biased at all, but you see these counter narratives mostly on social media, not on official media, which we can discuss. So I think this kind of negotiation and contestation, weighing and reweighing of this triangle, who is aligned with who? For instance, Germany sees itself very much as aligned with Jews in this conflict. Is there kind of a weight in one direction where two groups align more closely with one another in certain circumstances? We see this happening as we speak because of the crisis. And this is an acute moment where I think many of the themes I'll talk about, even though I'm not talking directly to the conflict, will resonate with you because of the conflict and speak to that as well. So my own research, as Sami introduced, has focused on Muslims, Jews, and Europe. And it began with this research in European mosques over a decade ago. One here in the UK in East London, the East London Mosque, and one in Berlin, the Scheidlik Mosque, which is in Neukölln. Neukölln is actually known as the quote unquote Palestinian capital of Europe. There's a large Palestinian population there. It also has a large Israeli population. And it's in German news and some Europe-wide news has been this kind of neighborhood that's represented as alternatively a dangerous place for Jews and a multicultural Mecca. So there's these counter narratives again, these struggles over what is Neukölln, what does it represent? Now, in that book, I focused quite a bit on the thought of 20th century Jewish thinkers. So I looked to 20th century Jewish thinkers, mostly German Jewish thinkers, who were conceptualizing difference, their own negative differentiation from society, being somewhat part of society and set apart from it, and how they grappled with this position in society. And I use that to try to understand how Muslims in a similar position today are grappling with their position in European societies. And this is why I turned to Zimmel. So Zimmel's theory of the stranger, in which Zimmel essentially says that the stranger is an insider-outsider, someone who is within but does not belong to a society fully, who's expected to maybe go, although they've been maybe born into that society or long lived there. They're seen as temporary, unsettling the order of things. And he described the classic example of this as being the European Jew. And a lot of my work has grappled with how both Jews and Muslims alike occupy this position, this in-between position in European contexts, and how they both together and apart occupy it. And again, I will turn to kind of concrete examples of this with the Jewish Museum in a moment. So now I will turn to the Jewish Museum. So this is an image of the Contemporary Jewish Museum in Berlin. It was founded in 2001 after decades of struggle over who should represent German Jewish history and the present, how it should be physically represented, who should curate it, who should be the president, who should also bring in the kind of living history, because at the time, and still to this day, many objects were being acquired by the Jewish Museum. Families were coming and telling their stories. There is this ongoing curatorial aspect of this museum that draws on individual and family histories. But what you see in this image is two buildings, right? So you see the zigzag, which is the sort of famous building designed by Daniel Libeskind. And he was selected to do this kind of lightning bolt shape. And that's where the main exhibition is. And then you see this older building, which was once the Royal Court of Justice in Berlin in the 19th century. And that is kind of has like a cafe in the opening or the entryway, but not the actual exhibitions. So in 2006, under the leadership of the inaugural director, Michael Blumenthal, Silly Kugelmann, the Jewish Frankfurter I mentioned, who was born in exile and then returned as a child to grow up in Berlin or in Frankfurt, became the first curator of the Jewish Museum Berlin. So it opened really around that time in 2006. She had a vision of opening the museum to the world, both her and Blumenthal. And I've interviewed her extensively about this and about the kind of trajectory of the museum that I'll share today. So in her own words, there's Silly Kugelmann. I was recruited for this job, and at the time I was a committed chain smoker. Michael Blumenthal was also a committed chain smoker, and we were committed to the same aim. He nor I were interested in a Jewish institution. Our agenda was rather to look at the historical and current problems and give a variety of interpretations that resonate with the world that we actually live in. Blumenthal and I said, oh, you can't see but that's fine. I like this. Yeah. Okay, to hell with it. We want to do something that is relevant for the society itself. Not surprisingly, she becomes known as this kind of controversial curator, someone who does quote unquote provocative installations. Now, she told me in my interviews with her that to be relevant to the society also meant to speak to the growing Turkish population, the large and growing Turkish population in Berlin, the largest minority in Germany, and to speak to Islam when speaking to Judaism as well. So she pushed for the development of a Jewish-Muslim tour in the museum that brought into conversation the two religious traditions and also the two histories of migration, forced migration out of Germany and migration as so-called guest workers into Germany. In 2013, which is now a decade ago, I interviewed a tour guide named Harun. He was one of many Turkish tour guides in the Jewish Museum. And they all told me the same story, essentially. They became tour guides because they saw themselves in the Jewish experience. Not in the Holocaust, not in that, but in this sense of being at once part of and set apart from society, feeling that you were never fully belonging, that you were questioned, that you were seen as uncivil or quote unquote barbaric at times when controversies would happen. For him, this controversy was the circumcision, the outlawing of circumcision that happened in 2012. So we met in this, they call it a sukkah, but it is a cafe in the Jewish Museum that has this kind of top. So it's very architecturally evocative. That is in like if it reflects the light at certain times of day in the shape of 6 pointed stars. The Jewish Museum became this place throughout my research. My research was in a mosque in the adjacent neighborhood, but really not far away. Like I could walk between the two institutions. Became this place where you saw the urban struggles happening in Berlin and the broader struggles happening in Germany and in Europe. You saw them kind of condensed in the struggles that were happening within this institution, why I became interested in it. So in the Jewish Museum Berlin, there were many exhibitions that brought together Jewish and Muslim perspectives and experiences. Beginning in 2005, there was the tour that I described that was a Jewish-Muslim tour of the museum. And now here are some of the more quote unquote controversial. You can decide if they're really controversial. You'll probably know my opinion or not, but they were seen as controversial. So you see Here one which was on head coverings and women, or yeah, hair and head coverings. There was one on ritual circumcision, which happened again because in 2012, temporarily, Germany outlawed circumcision, which of course created a lot of uproar in both Jewish and Muslim communities. And then the Welcome to Jerusalem exhibition. The Welcome to Jerusalem exhibition, according to Silly Kugelman, and genealogically, is the last sort of special exhibition that happens. And she thinks it's one of the reasons that the museum essentially got shut down for a period. She calls it the beginning of the end. So in 2018 and, this one is in 2013 first. Oh, I don't know if we'll be able to hear it, but there are these little videos that show you, they're like a minute, the different exhibitions. There was the snippet Stances on Ritual Circumcision exhibition, which again came after this outlawing and then re-allowing in law, but in a much more regulated way. So there were still repercussions of the outlaw on circumcision. I don't know if we can hear it. If not, it's fine too. Oh, yeah. So she curated it in 2013, but it comes out in 2014. At the same time, you have, of course, crises in Israel and Gaza. And that, again, influences the way this is portrayed in the media and the need to, quote unquote, protect Jews. So the language shift is really interesting because what you see is this language shift from outlawing circumcision in 2012 to protecting Jews by making sure that you have safe circumcision. Only with doctors, you can't have moles, you can't have any kind of religious actor, only with approved doctors, which is seen to protect specifically Jewish bodies. And when you read the newspaper, the outlawing was an outlawing against the practice because a Muslim boy had complications from the procedure. But the allowing or kind of negating that outlawing was because of Jewish bodies and the need to protect Jewish bodies within Germany, although it obviously is affecting both. Oh. This was the one on head coverings, and this again, well, you can see for yourself. And then I'll tell you.
Noch immer gilt in vielen Kulturen das öffentlich zu zeigen, ob Perücke, Burka oder Ordenstracht. Das Jüdische Museum in Berlin wirft einen Blick auf die weibliche Verschleierung, ihre Tradition und religiöse Bedeutung. Zudem liefern jüdische und muslimische Künstlerinnen ihre Visionen zu diesem aktuellen Thema. Cherchez la femme, ein Beitrag zur Stellung der Frau zwischen Religion und Selbstbestimmung.
So again, the way this was perceived, which was in 2000 and here was this one. Sorry, I think this was the earliest one. I think this one actually was before the circumcision. Sorry, that one was in 2006. That one was the most controversial because it was seen as not belonging in a Jewish museum. There was this kind of public view that something on head coverings belongs in a Muslim context or in relation to Muslim populations and not Jews. So again, it's this strange framing that separates the groups out, which is, I would say, the German approach to Jewish-Muslim relations. So here finally is Jerusalem. This undid everything for Silly Kugelman. She says that this is the exhibition that was the most dear to her. She poured her heart into it. She thought it was vital because it not only represented the three monotheistic traditions, but it also integrated very explicitly the fight over Jerusalem between Israelis and Palestinians. And so many people, it was the most visited exhibition that she had of these temporary special exhibitions. So many people came to see this and it resonated with them. But then she says she started to be accused of provocation. She didn't contend with this claim, which I really liked, actually, how she explained it. She said, everyone told me I was a provocateur. And I said, you can only open discussions and change the mindset if you're provocative. You can only instigate thinking this way, and it hurts sometimes. When you have to solve contradictions presented to you as a provocation, then you start to reconsider. Ultimately, art has this task. And for me, exhibitions are a specific form of art. In a book, you have a variety of ways of presenting things, from positivist to emotional. In film, which is an emotional art form, you can inspire people to laugh or cry. Every art has its own right. I think that exhibitions should be considered as a form of art based in the three-dimensional remains of culture. Now, this very short summary of these kind of key exhibitions and that were seen as controversies culminates in the closure of the Jewish Museum. But it's not only because of her sort of provocative exhibitions, it's also because in 2019, the head of the intellectual wing of the Jewish Museum Berlin, the Academy, it's called, it has this academy that used to be focused, because of Silly Kugelmann and Michael Blumenthal, on migration and on Muslim life in Europe. That was the two foci. It's not any longer that. But because the head of that, who is a Palestinian German woman, Yasmin Schumann, she invited a very well-known BDS supporter, who was an academic, to be on a panel. That was seen as a no-go move to make in Germany. And what happens is, well, that's another sukkah. What happens is that the Jewish Museum gets shut down. They say they're redoing it. They're redoing the main exhibition. They did change the main exhibition, but they actually changed the leadership entirely. Everyone leaves in the leadership. Kugelmann retires at that point, and she did reach the age where you're forcibly retired in Germany. But everyone else has to step down. The head of the museum, Yasmin Schumann, basically anyone in the management. And the Jewish Museum today has been reinvigorated as a Jewish institution. So it used to be an outward-facing institution meant to kind of engage with society as a whole. I would say now it's a Jewish institution. It's meant to engage with Jewish issues, Jewish history. It's much more internal-facing. Of course, it has tourists and it invites people into it to learn about the history of German Jews and Jews in Europe and places more broadly. But anything on contemporary Jewish life is Jewish focused. And I did interview some leadership there, whose names I will not expose, who told me explicitly, we cannot engage with Muslim issues. Like, that is the line that we now cannot cross. We won't. So we'll find other ways to talk about contemporary social issues as long as they're not Muslim issues. And this brought to the fore the question of who Jewish museums really are for. Are Jewish museums for Jews? Are Jewish museums for the wider public? Are they places to have conversation about pluralism and about things that went wrong in Europe and potentiality for the future? One of my slides is, yeah, I messed up, I think. But there was this famous or very kind of well-known piece in the New York Times that was written by a famous journalist in Germany named Joachim Bittner, and it was the title was "What and Whom Are Jewish Museums For?" And the question was really posing this, like, are they external facing or internal facing? So for Silly, obviously it was external facing. And when I spoke to Harun, that tour guide, about why this was, he said it was because of this idea of Muslims in particular being barbaric, and he kept relating it to the circumcision debate and crisis. For him, even coming back to this many years later, this idea that, as he, in his words, a practice on a Muslim boy specifically in that case was portrayed as barbaric. He thought that this kind of showed the distinction of Muslims from Germany, and that they were seen as not having, quote unquote, arrived here, not arrived in Germany per se, but arrived in modernity, is how he put it. At the same time, he did talk about how there were intersections in the Jewish-Muslim experience in that crisis, and that there were people who basically said, we have the quote unquote strangers of society together. He used those words as well. We have the Muslims and Jews together, and they're both terrible. That was kind of the far right wing in Germany. But he said, what he found really surprising was that many of his Jewish friends found this an unfathomable thing in Germany. So they couldn't believe, given the past, that they were being othered in this way, that they were being regulated, their bodies were being regulated in this way, whereas he said Muslims were used to it. You know, we have all these prohibitions. We have prohibitions on mosques, how tall they can be. We have prohibitions on halal food. We have kind of everything about us being a problem. And so in that moment, he told me he also saw the distinction, although they both had been othered, that this really was a quote unquote Muslim problem. Now, Harun and many people that I've interviewed over the years speak quite a bit about this divergent or differential treatment of Muslims and Jews in Germany. They often speak of this hierarchization of minorities, which was a term used by one of Sami's researchers from London on the Encounters Project. I will remember her name, but it's not my term. But she talked about this hierarchy of minorities. And in Germany, there is this hierarchy with Jews and Muslims, certainly. Harun used the words of secondary placement, like we're placed below Jews, even though we're both othered. And we haven't been recognized in the same way. There has been a lot of language, not just in Germany, throughout Europe, of the Judeo-Christian. This has been really critiqued in a way that I find very convincing by a philosopher, Anja Topolsky, the Netherlands, who has argued that this is a kind of supersessionist vision, that the Judeo-Christian is really that there were Jews and there was the Judeo, and now Christianity has come after and improved upon it. But still, that language is often used to set Muslims apart. And in Germany, it's used constantly in the media and politics. We are a Judeo-Christian nation. We are a Judeo-Christian society, meaning we're not Muslim. Now, this became very obvious in the works of this not representative SPD, former SPD member, Thilo Sarrazin, who wrote these two inflammatory books. The first one was about Germany undoing itself, and the second one was I will talk about in a moment. But when he talked about Germany undoing itself, he spoke about genetic inferiority. And at first he spoke about both Muslims and Jews, but then he realized he can't speak about Jews this way in German publics. He was on a show where someone asked him, who are you talking about? And he quickly responded, not Jews, I'm talking about Muslims and Arabs. And so he made this discernment between which minority groups you could other in that very, very problematic way. So Harun reflected quite a bit on this in our conversations. He explained that when he had mentioned genes and Jews, then Thilo Sarrazin, this kind of fallen SPD politician, who was a bestseller. So both of his books are bestsellers in Germany. So he might have been kind of politically excluded, but his books are extremely popular. He got very critiqued, but when he mentioned Arabs and Turks, nobody said anything. So it's not just that he said this, it was that the response to it was silent. When he said something again about Jews in one talk, he realized that the public wouldn't accept it, and he apologized for it. But of course, he never did that for Muslims and Arabs. So the second book that he wrote, Hostile Takeover, How Islam Prevents Progress and Threatens Society, became even more targeted critique of Islam and Muslims. Now, in spite of the quote unquote red line regarding anti-Semitism in the German public sphere and the critique of or othering of Jews, there is a rise in anti-Semitic attacks in the last decade in Germany, not just in the aftermath of the October 7th attacks. And Muslims, again, I brought up this trope, I won't go into it too much more, are blamed for it. And this has become a really powerful narrative. Although all of this research is consistently done by the German government, that shows that the vast majority of attacks and threats come from the far right wing, white nationalist men generally. Muslims are still blamed for this quote unquote new anti-Semitism. And here is our dear Joachim Bittner writing about it for the New York Times again. And this time, he really pushes this paradigm, saying it's a Muslim problem. It's, again, this idea, this is in Esra Osterrich's work, that anti-Semitism, classical anti-Semitism, has been purged from Germany through their education, through all of the memory work that they've done. But it's back because we now have Muslim migrants, again, many of whom are not migrants, and they have brought it with them from their culture. This narrative doesn't only exist in Germany, it also exists in France. Sami had talked about Susan and the text that was written about the lost territories of the Republic after the Second Intifada in the early 2000s, in which there was this kind of focus on Islamism in the urban periphery of Paris. So this conversation, I want to point out, also happens in the German case as well. It doesn't just happen from sort of mainstream non-Muslim, non-Jewish actors, but also from Jewish actors. So the Central Council of Jews in Germany have actually spoken about this same kind of trope quite extensively, even though, again, they don't speak about the sort of right-wing violence to the same extent at all. But there are these counter narratives. So one example that we discussed when I was preparing this talk was about the so-called kippah experiment in Paris, where this man is walking through the 18th district of Paris wearing a kippah, people spit on him, he catches it on his secret camera. But a follow-up counter narrative is filmed by another Parisian who wears a kippah and walks on the Parisian periphery. And instead, what you see is people stopping and talking to him and engaging with him in a very quote unquote civil manner. And so the question is also, which narratives do we get and ingest, and which do we believe? Because it's not always based on fact, or even seeing that might not change your perception. So in this new anti-Semitism narrative, I think there is no better fitting quote to summarize it than that of Richard Sennett in his book, Building and Dwelling, which is on cities. He says that images of the stranger define exactly how a people does not want to see itself, as in the portrait in Oscar Wilde's The Picture of Dorian Gray. And I think in this case, in the German case and wider Europe, but certainly in the German case, there is this sense that Germany does not want to see itself as still bearing, oh, that was my last slide, the brunt of anti-Semitism. It wants to see itself as having purged this anti-Semitism, overcome it. And this idea or this ideal hasn't been reached. And so it projects the negative onto the quote unquote stranger, onto Muslims who are seen to threaten Jews. So I've talked a lot about Jews and Muslims in the German case in the Jewish Museum, which again sort of collapsed and now has been rebuilt as a very different institution. Sorry. But within this whole story, I think I haven't talked as much about Europe. So what is Europe? Is Europe Christian or post-Christian? Is it secular? Do Jews belong to Europe through this kind of bracketed Judeo? Muslims belong to Europe, although many politicians will say Muslims belong to Germany. This is another debate in Germany. But Islam doesn't belong to Germany, or Islam does belong to Germany. Do they really? And how does the contemporary period relate to the past? So in even the Reconquista period, what you saw was the othering of Jews and Muslims together. Often in the stories we tell, including my own work, so I will out my own mistakes here, I've talked about how kind of the Jewish question has been replaced by the Muslim question. But really the Jewish question and the Muslim question have been entwined with one another in a deeply historical way. So Jews and Muslims were killed, expelled, forced to convert in the same period. Actually, under the Fourth Lateran Council, which is in the 13th century, Jews and Muslims were forced at the same time to wear distinctive clothing to set them apart from the Christian mainstream. So this kind of formation of Europe as exclusive has always cast Jews and Muslims as strangers, sometimes together and sometimes apart, and often in relation to one another. So sometimes they're both seen as strangers, like in the quote that Harun gave me saying, these kind of right-wing people, they like to see us both as strangers, and that's why they support banning circumcision. But sometimes it's one against the other, as in this kind of this new anti-Semitism discourse. And Europe finds itself right now, obviously, in this very strange position, because Europe is not just, and Germany is not just seeing itself as responsible for protecting Jewish life, given its very particular history, but Europe is also responsible for the creation of Israel and plays a large role in the creation of Israel. And that is left out of these narratives on Jewish and Muslim discourse and discord at the moment. So it's rare that you'll read in the mainstream media that, you know, Jews and Muslims and Europe are struggling with their role in this conflict. It's this pitting against Jews and Muslims against each other that again allows Europe to sort of step out of responsibility for a situation. So the Jewish question and the Muslim question, they essentially leave you at the question of Europe. That's my conclusion. So these questions are used to invoke or they're not used to invoke, they're used to avoid questions about Europe. They're used to project ideas and ideals about Europe, and they're used to project the negative aspects of Europe on to others. There is, however, this kind of notable pull to think about Jewish and Muslim life together. So you see that in Silly Kugelman's project, and you see that in many projects. And I think in this terrible moment, that is something that I see happening and that I'm in specific networks, but that there is this desire to kind of think together about the position of Muslims in Europe. That's also Anya Topolsky's argument, where she says that she basically says that we should think about how Muslims are othered today in relationship to how Jews have been othered in modernity in Europe. And like both her and Kugelman, I'm not suggesting parallels between the contemporary situation and the Holocaust, but I am saying that there is a way in which Muslims and Jews provide something that Walter Benjamin called a window mirror. They provide this kind of sight into and reflection of Europe. And this brings me to this idea that I have, and I bet others probably had before me, of critical strangerhood. So you might be a stranger, you might be inside and outside of society. But as Zygmunt Bauman has written about strangers, the stranger rebels. Critical strangerhood I see as this kind of form of self-articulation here in which Muslims and Jews can speak to and through one another, as well as to and through the European projects and the projects of European societies. Just as Zimmel and then later Arendt, Bauman, and others like my colleague today, Jakob Felt, have used the experience of European Jews to theorize the stranger, I believe that we can also theorize it more universally, and we can use it to theorize how and why Jews and Muslims find themselves in this difficult situation, and this triangle that often gets weighted in different ways. So Bauman has written of the stranger as being always on the outside, even when they're inside, examining the familiar as if it was a foreign object of study, asking questions no one else asked, questioning the unquestionable, and challenging the unchallengeable. Interestingly, a scholar of Islamic thought, Ibrahim Musa, who also happened to have married me, I mean, not married me, but been the person who married my husband and I, writes about this experience of the stranger as well from a Muslim theological perspective. And he says that this produces something called the diflis, the cultural threshold space. The experience of the stranger allows them to see things, to view things in a way that a domesticated or complacent gaze may fail to observe. That is, the stranger positionality endows the subject with a kind of critical gaze that clarifies. So if we think now about this fateful triangle of Jews, Muslims in Europe, the figure of the stranger, Muslim, Jew, together and apart, becomes not only in between, transcending boundaries and orders, but also perhaps an intermediary, able to speak between and thus speak to the question of Europe in new ways. These ways are often uncomfortable and discomforting, as we see today. When you see Jews speak for ceasefires, when you see Muslims standing at synagogues, it makes, it unsettles certain things. It makes certain people uncomfortable. They may get demonized. They may get told they're being quote unquote instrumental. And yet, this speaking through this strangerhood, there is an opportunity in it. So Hannah Arendt, for instance, who was seen as such a stranger, is often called the prophet of nonconformity. And so too was Silly Kugelman, a similar type of figure, and still is from behind the scenes, refusing to conform to her imagined place in European history, instead emplacing herself and a much larger project of the Jewish Museum in Berlin into contemporary Germany. She pioneered by creating a version of the Jewish Museum Berlin that spoke to the Jewish history of Germany, the present of history, and also the broader context of strangerhood through her exhibitions that united Muslims and Jews in their work in the museum. So those tour guides like Harun, but also in the topics of the exhibition. In so doing, resonating with the world that we actually live in which Muslim and Jewish lives are entwined with one another in the project and projections of Europe, both present and past. I'll stop talking.
Okay, if we could invite questions, either in person or online. Please.
Hi, thank you. Fantastic talk. I really enjoyed it thoroughly, and I'm grateful, for having the chance to listen to it. My question to you, based on what you've seen and the way Europe and have been trying to get this kind of fixed picture of what a Jew should be, what a Muslim should be, and anybody who's criticizing one or the other. Do you think the definition of anti-Semitism has been hollowed out now because it's been branded left, right, and center, even against Jews who've been called anti-Semites? Do you think that, again, as a definition, has evolved or devolved, whatever, to mean something completely different because people are still fixated on looking at somebody who's criticizing a view of practice, without going too much into politics, that definition had to evolve or change because of that?
Yeah, I guess so. Let's figure out if there's online questions.
Yeah. So I think it's defined in different ways by different actors, but I think it can be certainly used to silence people and hold movements. So I think there's a whole group of Jews. I just had a conversation about this yesterday, of Jews for peace or ceasefire, that's sort of their goal, who are at the March for Palestine, or I don't know what the name of it was, but this weekend, and they said they were there to have their images taken by the media, thousands of them, or at least 1,000 of them in a line. They wanted images of them at the march so people couldn't say it was an anti-Semitic march. And then they said they weren't really covered in the media, shockingly. And so I think that it depends how it's used, and I think sometimes it's labeled in a way to silence, and another way to foster these divisions even more deeply. And I didn't go into details, but in one of the headlines I showed you, there was this kind of new anti-Semitism was being invoked in Germany, and they were saying now there are all these things happening there. The Stars of David have been drawn on people's homes. The Muslims are terrorizing Jews. So there was no proof. No one knows who did that. And they assigned the whole things to Muslims and this new anti-Semitism. So I definitely think, I think the language, I don't want to be on video recording saying certain things, but I think the language in this whole situation we're in now, language is being very abused. It is being used correctly by some, and then just terms are being thrown out there where people don't know things. I think I gave this example today to Tony, where a student had from the river to the sea, and I asked, what does that mean to you? From what river to the sea? And the student said, I think the Atlantic Ocean. So that moment, to me, that's an extreme case, but where these words are being used. And it is happening in Jewish, I have been in Jewish circles where people are calling one another anti-Semitic, are saying if you don't wholeheartedly support Israel in the war, you are not a Jew, or you're anti-Semitic. So I think there are these ways in which that language, it's we need that language because it's dangerous when it actually is there. But then that language can be abused and misused. Yeah.
Judith?
Hello, good evening. I'm Judith. I'm from Bournemouth. I'm the editor of the Wessex Jewish News. I'm sorry I didn't hear the beginning of
We
your
can't
talk.
hear you, Judith.
If you check the speakers up.
Hello, can you hear me? Yes. Good evening. I'm Judith. I'm from Bournemouth, the editor of the Wessex Jewish News. I apologise I didn't hear the beginning of your talk, but I'd like to raise 2 points which may seem very simplistic to you in this very academic talk that you're giving. The actual word anti-Semitic was invented by a German round about 1860 or 70, and I wonder if it's time to rename it as anti-Jewish hatred. That's the first thing. The second thing is, might it be the right time to remind 1.5 billion Christians around the world that Jesus was born a Jew, because many of them don't seem to know. So I'm sorry if this is simplistic, but it seems common sense to me. Thank you.
I actually immediately thought of, so when the museum closed, they still had Silly Kugelman, the curator, do the permanent exhibition, like redo it. And one of the first things she did was create a room with famous Jews in it. And the most famous Jew is Jesus in the room. So she tried to make that point. And I think as a connective point again, right? If you walk through and you see that, it makes you think. Most visitors are coming because it's a major institution. But I do think two things it made me think of. The same conversations are happening in many Muslim groups who are saying, like, is Islamophobia is not the right language? Is it anti-Muslim hatred, or is it anti-Muslim prejudice or racism? Or so again, I think these, like the words, I think it is a time in which to think about what words we use, very much so. I've been reflecting on this a lot myself, and I don't have any concrete suggestions, but I do think this is making me realize how much the language we use has certain types of power. But left out of this also is the Christian perspective. So I didn't bring that in, kind of through the back door with Europe and the formation of Europe through and with Christianity. But I also think there is, you actually could also look at a triangle with Christians, Muslims, and Jews on these issues, and how they intersect and influence one another.
Thank you.
Thank you. Mute myself. Oh no, I won't mute myself. I was gonna mute myself.
Thanks very much, Elisabeth, for your great paper. In the spirit of provocation that
Yes.
you raised, if Europe was open and inclusive, it wouldn't be Europe.
Sure.
Then that the only solution is to think globally, and that Europe's always been designed to exclude other places, other peoples, internal and external, and that we have to therefore think globally.
Think globally, and I think the word I had, which I didn't read the whole thing, so I didn't say it, was the local, which I used to laugh at when anthropologists would use them. But I think it's thinking globally and thinking locally, because most of your experiences happen on this very local level. And at least in my early, and actually in my research now, again, the same thing's happening where people identify with Berlin in this very deep way. And that's what happened with this mosque community, where people would say, like, I'm a Berliner, I'm a Muslim Berliner, or I'm a Berliner and I'm Muslim. And they kind of didn't talk about being German or Turkish, or because those national framings weren't fitting them in the right way, whereas Berlin was, or being from Neukölln, which is like this neighborhood. It's a sticking point with identities in Berlin. That's because of the Palestinian-Israeli presence, because you have this major mosque, another mosque, you have a major synagogue, one of the oldest. It has all of this kind of in a small space. People really identify with that neighborhood. People who are very cosmopolitan identify very intensely with that neighborhood. So I think you're right. I think thinking about Europe and thinking about nation states, of course, I'm not one of these sociologists who think we've moved beyond the nation state, but I think you have to kind of think on these other levels as well. And in terms of inclusivity, I agree in one way, but then how does it get like regulated? Because I feel international law never seems to function, and international regulations, how do you include on a global level? Do you open borders, but then you're not including? I mean, then Europe is going to not be Europe. Or do you? So I guess in a pragmatic way, but in terms of sort of intellectual, trying to understand belonging and people's experiences with one another and relationality in the world, I do think thinking more globally and more locally is productive.
Hi. I think the point around that you make around language is really, really powerful as well. And also to your point about the global and the local. I think we have to also be mindful and think of, when we talk about global, who's it for? I loved your point about who's it for. So working around inclusivity and diversity, we have to understand who's it for. Is it because there is inequality that exists, or is it because it's for the people that experience the inequality? And I think that's quite a difficult thing to look at. And when we then look at language is probably the most prohibitive thing that we all inherit, and we don't reflect on that enough in terms of the difference between lots of the groups that we talk about. Not only are just borders or demographics or geographic, they're language based as well, and we inherit that. And the global language that we use and we see in the media and we kind of nonchalantly make normal can be the most divisive thing. And that's why I think conversations like this are really useful to reflect back on that. And I think it's the first action point. Be aware of how we structure ourselves. And I always use this quote, and I think I overuse it. It's a Audre Lorde quote that says that the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house.
Yeah.
And I think sometimes when we just have these conversations, we have to be aware of how polarizing language is. So I don't even know if that's a question, but yeah.
It's a great comment.
Yeah.
I fully agree. I think language is, and it's on so many levels. Who has even access to the conversations, and what conversations and what language is allowed in certain spaces and what language is covered. For instance, in media right now, with all what is certain language, certain expressions are being covered over and over again, whereas other things are left out. They don't fit the kind of neat narratives. And it actually makes me think of one of my closest friends is a philosopher who works on bringing people together around difficult topics. So she was working on bringing Black Americans with the police to talk about issues surrounding police violence, bringing anti-abortion activists with pro-choice activists together, Trump supporters and progressive. But she said this situation was by far the hardest she's been in. And the one thing that worked was when people don't get to talk back. So if you get to tell your personal story, but no one's allowed to respond or react. And then we talked about this today, and Sami was telling me about a colleague of his who has people sit down and write and then share. So it's you first have to actually express the language, because there's also something in the quickness. Now you'll see how old I am in my critique of social media, in which we can respond and get into these kind of conversations that are not reflective, and that you don't have to kind of think about how you're saying something, what words you're using when you speak or when you write. It's more like a reactive, ping pong match.
So we miss the listening. And sometimes that's the most important part. I think we have to say something. We were talking about it. Sorry. We were talking earlier around this desire now for everybody to have to say something or make a statement or take a position. And really what we could be doing is listening to groups. And where you mentioned Black groups, so I do a lot of work with the police and with the National Health Service, really.
Yeah.
And the biggest problem is people don't feel listened to in many spaces. So where you talk about the kind of the seen and the unseen, it's because the spaces you don't feel a part of that conversation. So yeah.
That's a great point. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk, and my apologies for being late. It was just a question of navigating the building. The mention of global and local gives you a kind of distance dimension, a geographical dimension. But I wonder about the time dimension. Is this triangle one that has always been there, everywhere, unrelieved, in your view? And if it is, does that suggest that it always will be, 'twas ever thus, as it were? So really, what's the historical perspective on this, please?
It's a really good question. I think, although I'm not a historian, I think that there is there are moments. So I don't think it's that this is always kind of evoked, especially in every European society, but you have these formative moments. For instance, I researched Spain. So I researched Germany, I researched the UK. I'm also researching the UK, France and Spain. So I'm researching Spain right now. And well, that is one present history. So you go to Spain and you have this narrative around the Reconquista, You have the narrative around forming Spanishness, the Spanish nation, by purging Jews and Muslims. That's very powerful. You have the citizenship law that allows Jews to get citizenship if they can prove their heritage, or did allow, but not Muslims. And the conversations that were happening when I was there recently were re-invoking this triangulated relationship by saying, well, we have to regulate Islam in certain ways because otherwise it's not safe for Jews. There are not a lot of Jews in Spain, but it's not safe for Jews. It's not safe for Spain as a whole, but also Jews. And I think in different contexts, it's different. So I don't claim to that it's always there, but I think there are these kind of like, as my supervisor would say, cultural sociology, background scripts. There are these like background narratives from history that get re-invoked. And I had a review on a paper, which was when I started thinking about this kind of Muslim question, Jewish question, developing more evenly rather than one like replacing the other. And that reviewer was a historian and went back into all these moments in Spanish history where they're kind of othered together, where they're not necessarily pitted against each other, but there is a kind of holding up of one group, well, Jews and not Muslims in contemporary history. And I think that there is something to say for these narratives from the past coming back, even if they haven't continuously been there. But they're really interesting moments. Like you might not know, but most of Franco's army was Muslims from Morocco. His own personal guard were fully Muslim. There's a whole Muslim infrastructure in Spain that's been erased because it doesn't fit with the narrative of a sort of Catholic, secular Spanish project, or Catholic really. But yeah, and I do think it depends on the context, and I think it depends on what use it's been politically. And I think they're different. So for a long period, like in Germany, Muslims were seen as this external other, actually. The empire, a threat, like formidable frenemy, I don't know, because they worked with the Ottoman Empire very closely. Whereas Jews were seen as this internal disorder creating minority. So it shifts now because now they're inside of Europe. But even some of the tropes you hear today are like they've gotten inside of the gates, or so they draw on those kind of historical narratives. But what a historical sociologist or a historian should do is trace one country. And I think the historical incidents and also the coverage in public debates would be really interesting.
Your mention of Spain in particular rang bells, because what I had in mind was the story of possibly the legend of Cordoba in the 12th and 13th century, which kind of suggests, if we believe the tales, that it doesn't always have to be thus.
Yeah.
That it could be different. It was different.
And Spain really claims that narrative too, which I find interesting, although in the moment really sets people apart. But I agree. Whether it's true, I mean, it is true to a degree. We don't know to what degree, but there was a different type of living together.
Yeah.
And there are, I believe there must be possibilities for this as well.
Thank you.
Thank you.
The observation first about the Muslim Germans or Muslims in Germany is that, as you rightly say, if there's a sort of upsurge of anti-Semitism, then people are very quick to play that blame game, as it were. And yet the other sort of thing that Israel Zurich brings out quite nicely is that whenever Muslims start sort of empathizing with Jewish suffering, they also get told, no, you're not allowed to do that.
It's the wrong feeling.
Because if you're going to be a good sort of model German citizen, you've got to embrace the kind of encumbrances of the sort of perpetrator culture.
Completely.
And so it seems to me they can't win.
No.
And maybe that tells you something too. But what I wanted to actually ask you about was again to come back to this kind of sort of local, global, whatever thing, and just ask you how far you think a story about Berlin can do that kind of heavy lifting on behalf of Germany. I mean, very sort of notoriously, a few months ago or so, Friedrich Merz says Kreuzberg ist nicht Deutschland, right? And he's saying it for the wrong reasons, because he hates this sort of multicultural, diverse, environment where people kind of get along and they have their conflicts and they all plays out, but by and large, it's an interesting place and enriched for it. But although he's saying it for the wrong reasons, he's also right.
Yeah.
That Neukölln or Kreuzberg just isn't provincial Germany. And so I kind of want to know what the kind of the municipal, the communal politics are that are going on in Berlin behind how this museum gets funded, why it gets pulled. That must have something to do with the Christian Democrats kind of looking over their shoulders at the AfD. You know, I don't know enough about Berlin's municipal politics, but my guess is this might play out slightly differently in, I don't know, Düsseldorf or some small town somewhere.
Yeah. I think a lot. So to multiple of your points, the first point I totally agree with the sort of empathy versus you don't belong if you hate Jews for sure, but you also don't belong if you feel too much close to Jews, because that's, and in fact, I started thinking of it in the reverse because I realized at some point as a Jewish New Yorker who grew up saying, I'm going to be a sociologist and I'll study anything but Jews. I studied every survivor. I was like, I'll study refugees. And then I started reading about Europe and I was like, oh, they're kind of like the Jews. I'm going to study the Turks in Germany and understand like that migration and the history and being othered in Germany. But now I embrace studying Jewish life as well. But I think that sense of empathy motivated a lot of the, like all of the Muslim Turkish museum workers. That's because they felt empathy that they were working in a Jewish museum. They're not getting like a lot of big bucks. But yes, Berlin is a special place. Berlin is not representative of Germany. I think that's very true. I think it depends what you're looking at specifically. The institution itself, I mean, it's hard to know because there isn't such a thing in other places. So there is the Frankfurt Jewish Museum, for instance, which is like art from Jews from Frankfurt and a history of Jews in Frankfurt. It's a very different institution. There's nowhere else that's trying to represent collectively all of German Jewish life. I'm sure it would play out differently, not in Berlin. I do think it was politics. I do think it was both internal and external. It was another point at which there was global and also conflict in Israel and Palestine cropping up again. So I think there's like the local Berlin, there's also the national, I think the rising AfD right wing. I think there's pressure to quash anti-Semitism from Muslims, a Palestinian woman working in a Jewish museum who brings in BDS supporters. I mean, it is sort of asking for a reaction, I think. I mean, I don't know this, I don't even recall who it was. I meant to look that up for the talk. But it's not about the person, it's about the symbolism. So she is making a point. She has to be. You wouldn't do that by mistake, I think. So having a Palestinian woman working and heading the intellectual arm of a Jewish museum, also very Berlin. You probably wouldn't have that in Frankfurt or another place, but it's a good point. And kind of working through this case in my book, I think looking into the kind of political fallout and some of the there were very specific political actors as well. It is funded by the German state. Also, Netanyahu wrote to the museum to tell them that the Kaaba, not the Kaaba, sorry, the he called it like the Kaaba, the Muslim mosque in Jerusalem. Al-Aqsa was looked bigger than the Kaaba. That's like the language he used supposedly, and much bigger than any Jewish sites. And he was horrified that you would have the Muslim site be the biggest, even though, I mean, obviously it's the tallest of all the sites that were represented in the exhibition. And so there was pressure kind of from many sides. So I think part of it is very much a Berlin story. It's hard to generalize, but it's hard to generalize from anywhere in Germany. And coming from the US, which is much larger and I think even more radically different, Germany also. So I live now in Baden-Württemberg, where nobody spends money on anything. And it's a very different place from Berlin. It's very pristine and organized. Well, all Germany is quite organized, but more organized. And then there's East Germany and those kind of the way in which life in East Germany of individuals in my age generation as children and their parents, how that kind of shapes perspectives. So it is fractured and fragmented, and governance in Germany is extremely disaggregated. So it happens on the local level. When you have the headscarf debates in France, you have them in Germany, but what happens is it gets regulated at the city level, essentially. It's not going to be regulated at the federal level or even state level often. So you're having this very disaggregated story. So it's hard to tell the story of Germany, I think. And Esra did really well in her book by going to different parts of Germany to look at these Muslim-only Holocaust education initiatives. And I think she found both similarities and differences.
I think one of the things, points going back to, again, it sounds like the local and global themes. And I think, again, intertwine that with the history and how much history has been rewritten to show one version which fits the narrative. And we want to keep that version because anything other than that will shake that picture in people's mind. Like we know that the Ottoman Empire actually housed the Jews who've been kicked out of Spain in Salonique and other parts. A lot of the Jewish diaspora, if you want to think about it, has been in the Middle East, not only in Europe, and they coexisted. I come from Damascus. I have 2 Jewish friends who are with me in the school, and we grew up together. So for us, these are Jews who've been there since Moses. So these are 3,000, 4,000 years old Jews. Saladin's physician in court was Maimonides, who was the writer of the Talmud. So when you think about all those stories and you think, wait a minute, so they always live with each other. But to clear the conscience of Europe of the kind of historical, and you only need to read sort of Elizabethan Shakespeare to Merchant of Venice to see how the common view of the Jews was at that time. And it's to clear their conscience as well. They basically decided to sort of coin these terms, and the Israel project as well. And again, was a European solution for a problem because there was Jews living in Palestine, funny enough, and they grew up like they were in Damascus, like they were in Jordan, in Yemen, in Morocco, in Egypt, in all those. And I think this is where now, and still is, you will look after your Jewish neighbors, and again, in Islamic tradition and prophetic tradition, you had a Jewish neighbor and he, attended to him when he was sick, when he was dying, he attended his funeral. So I think that's why history, and I'm glad now there is a bit more democracy, if you want to call it, of the media, although I am very not, hot on social media, but now I think because you're seeing other narratives coming up on board other than the official line, and that allowing people then to make judgments for themselves and undo some of the historical diet which has been given for one side, because it fits political agendas. And I think now a lot of things which you hear now with people coming up on social media and say, well, I didn't realize that this is the background to this or that or whatever or this. I'm seeing, again, the Jewish community, which I'm grateful for, to come out and say, look, we're not one. We're not following a particular narrative just because it suits a political agenda. We have a lot of sort of humanity which are shared with everybody else. And I think that's important. And I think, being that kind of objective is important rather than trying to pull a blanket over everybody and using language, which is very powerful when you coin a word and then use it and abuse it and historically evolve it to something else just so that it suits the narrative rather than genuinely reflect what it should be. I think that's something which is worth reflecting upon. Thank you.
It's a great point. I think, yeah, I agree. I think it's a great point. And I think the cloaking of things, even sometimes as interfaith or as if there's a religious conflict or like there's a religious, clash, when in reality, Judaism and Islam are very similar. I mean, they're not exactly the same, but they're very similar. You could find much more common ground, but that's why sometimes I find those, in Israel, that's actually what I researched a bit on, was these interfaith narratives, and I found it a bit funny because I thought but this isn't really a religious conflict. It's been projected outwards that way so that there is a broader conflict and division, but it's not a conflict about the religion. It's about land and politics. And but I agree. I think that's one positive. That's good. I'm gonna keep that democratization of knowledge and history. And there are these movements. I mean, I always talk about the Harki. How do you pronounce that? Harki in France, where you have those who are sort of involved in the civil war or the war for Algerian independence, and they're on the side of France, but the question is, how are they on the side of France and to what degree and under what conditions? But they're demonized by France, and there was a sort of revolt, I would almost say, of some of their daughters who have written out against this narrative. And I'm not saying it ended perfectly, but it did create a counter narrative that is a public narrative that you don't have on many other things. And I'll plug the work of my postdoc who's doing this on Spain and the Muslim soldiers who fought for Spain, who are often seen in Spain, or they fought under or with Franco. But again, these are people who someone comes to you and says, in the Spanish protectorate, they're economically struggling, most of them. We can pay for your family to have enough to eat. We can pay for your home. We can pay for provide what you need and pay you a salary. I don't think it's really an ideological, they were big Franco supporters. And I think that she's working on kind of exposing those narratives and unsettling this idea of perpetrators versus victims and who's a perpetrator and what. So I think, yeah, there is a need for more work that rethinks these histories. And many of them are right there, some of the examples you gave, and it's just shedding light on them or making them more known to broader publics.
What was the name of the first one?
Oh, Paula Arana Barbier, she's fantastic. But yeah. But I think that's a really great thing.
And if I may ask the question about is it necessary? Okay.
Yeah.
About Arabic, maybe, because it seems to me that there's a Europe-wide kind of devalorization of Arabic, the Arabic language, which is seen as a migrant language, a lesser language, in places like Berlin, definitely in France, where it's no longer taught as a second language, and yet it is, the second language. And so, and at the same time, we have a kind of glorious European history that very much maps onto an Arabic heritage from the Iberian Peninsula. So I was just wondering what you made of the dynamics of Arabic being spoken in the public sphere in Berlin, and whether or not it's this question of hate and fear arises in the public discourse around here. It seems to me that we've kind of got to the point where hearing Arabic is can be felt as an affront somehow in this specific situation, at the specific time with this conflict. And is that something?
I think definitely in this situation, because you hear Arabic much less than Turkish, which is sort of the second, I don't know, third, it's a dominant language in Germany. But I think in this moment, definitely hearing Arabic, using Arabic, events with Arabic, people gathering and speaking Arabic is seen as transgressive almost. But that's a really good point more broadly. I think it's true. It becomes sort of stigmatized and heard, negatively heard in a way that is different from, I would say Turkish is not the same, but it's also not imbued and it's not wound up in conflict and the same history. So it is seen as, threatening or definitely. And I think the coverage of things that happen, and also as a sort of not secret language, but a sort of, why is it happening in Arabic and why aren't they, if they're living in Germany, speaking in German and organizing in German and protesting in German, although many protests are in German, but some are also in Arabic. So it's a really interesting point.
Judith is raising her hand again.
School is out.
Yes, Judith. You need to unmute yourself.
Am I unmuted now? Yes, can you hear me? Yes, sorry. You've rightly focused a great deal on the history and the past and what has brought us to today. So I'm very interested to hear your take on which direction you think the Abraham Accords are signposting towards the future. Is it a real opportunity for understanding and peace?
My honest response? I mean, I want it to be. I am around some people who are more optimistic than me. I met one yesterday who told me, a close friend and colleague of mine, that she saw this something will shift, right? This is an untenable situation. It's like, it always feels it's going to explode. It exploded. Now something will shift, and that could, it's horrible, but maybe something good can happen. I don't think so. I don't see this shifting in my generation, my life. I hope I'm wrong, but I think that this is actually going to embed those sort of crises and those stereotypes and those divisions. I mean, you see it all over the world. I told Sami today that I had schools asking me, I grew up in New York City, so schools in New York reaching out to me. I'm not a teacher, I don't work in schools, saying, you know, our Jewish and Muslim students are fighting. I mean, these are divisions in communities that have been communities for decades. It's just, I don't have a lot of hope at the moment, but I hope what I do hope is that I'm wrong, and I'm just still feel very emotionally affected. I always had hope, to be honest. Like, I believed that there was more that unite us than divides us. I personally, my mother is Jewish, my father is Christian, my husband is Muslim. My kids embody this idea. To me, it's real in a very visceral way now. So I hope that I'm wrong, but the moment I don't. Maybe if there's some political overhaul of all of these leaders, because I also believe on a fundamental level, which is what I will tell these students, that most people don't want this. I mean, all over the world, not just in Israel, including in Israel and Palestine, most people want to live just regular, ordinary lives. But there are some people who do want this type of discord. They have a lot of power. So I think maybe if that power gets unsettled, I don't know, maybe there's hope.
There was the specific question about the
Abraham Accords?
Yeah, I mean, if you want to.
That I'm not, I guess my view is something new is needed, but I don't know what that new thing is, because it hasn't worked in the past. I'm unsure it can work in the future. But again, I think it depends who the leaders are, if it's coming from within these societies as well.
Yeah.
Because another issue, which I took a very Eurocentric view in this talk, is having Europe or the United States come from the outside and sort of push or implement. I think at the moment, I don't see that going well. And so far in history, it hasn't gone that well. So I mean, I think something that comes sort of from the ground up maybe has more hope. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks. Not positive note. We're doomed.
Yeah, I think
Great.
the Abraham Accords has brought things to a close.